All right. Hello, everyone out there. Hello, everyone out there. Buenos días. Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos. Welcome, good morning, and good afternoon. This is Tertulia Histórica, a lunchtime history lecture series sponsored by the Office of the State Historian. I'm Rob Martinez, and I'm the state historian, and I'm here to introduce our speaker today. Today, Dr. Rick Hendricks will be talking about explorers and bearded Utes, the expeditions of Lahontan, Rivera, Domínguez-Escalante. So, without further delay, please welcome Dr. Rick Hendricks.
Clovis, can they? No. Okay. Sharing. Okay. It's sharing, but yeah, can we start on the first slide, possibly? One more backwards. There we go. Okay, well, we can start there, Clovis, that's fine. So, first of all, welcome all you folks here and out in electronic land. When we started this series back before the pandemic, a tertulia, by its very nature, can be a conversation. So we thought about research in progress sometimes, and we've had presentations of that nature, and then we've had more complete lectures. What I'm going to do today is a little bit different, because I'm going to talk about some work that was done by a colleague of mine. I was involved to some extent, but he recently passed away. And so he's not really able to make any of these presentations, but this was sort of what I'm going to talk about to some extent was really his life work that was in two books that I'm going to talk a little bit about. His name was Stephen Baker. I'm going to talk about three expeditions that were into the area to the northwest of New Mexico in the colonial period. And they were in search of, among other things, a group of individuals that had been talked about, and the authorities in Mexico, Spanish authorities in Mexico City and in Spain, were very concerned about what appeared to be a population of individuals that had big bushy beards. And the thought was that these people were probably European, perhaps descendants from shipwreck, or in some way had come to be living in, they might be Frenchmen, which was a very big concern for Spanish authorities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where these individuals were located, and a little bit about these expeditions, but in the reverse order, because the way we've come to know about these explorations is in the reverse order of the way they happened, if that makes any sense. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Domínguez and Vélez de Escalante, normally referred to as the Domínguez-Escalante expedition, of 1776, which is the one that most of us have some familiarity with. Domínguez-Escalante and Domínguez, their names on the landscape in a lot of places. There's all sorts of things that are named after these individuals, one or more of these individuals, particularly in Colorado and in Utah. So this is the one that we know the most about. Most editions of their journal have been written about. The next one we're going to talk about is the Juan Maria de Rivera expedition, which is much less known. There were two of those, 1765, 1766. They were also into the area to the northwest of New Mexico. And then the last one, which is really the first one to take notice of what we've come to call the bearded Utes, was a French nobleman, the Baron Lahontan, and his expedition is from far north and down the rivers and then to the west in 1688 and 89. So let's go to the next slide. So modern anthropologists identify the people that, again, we've called bearded Utes as two groups, Pavans and Moanans, and they were living on either side of a river. They spoke the same dialect, but they were identified as being completely different groups. They were subsequently absorbed by Paiute and ceased to be identified as individual groups. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a map of Utah, and I don't know how this is going to work exactly. Okay, so this area here, which is called Sevier Lake, and then here's Lake Utah and the Great Salt Lake up here. Okay, so these groups lived on either side of the Sevier River. So that was the area they were located. And the lake where they were is also quite saline. So it appears that when the explorers were traveling and encountering people who were from that area, and they talked about a salt lake, they weren't necessarily talking about the Great Salt Lake. They were talking about this heavily saline smaller lake, which is, of course, south of the Great Salt Lake. So, and there's a river, which I have another illustration where you can see the river and you can get an idea of where those groups of people live. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here you can see Sevier Lake and then the Sevier River that runs. And so on either side were these two groups. That was where they were living. Again, described as being two completely separate groups, but speaking the same language. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an illustration of the Domínguez-Escalante expedition. Let's go to the next one. Domínguez and Escalante had Ute guides with them, and they also had people that had been on the earlier expedition. So Domínguez-Escalante went on they left basically Santa Fe. They went on a loop all the way into Utah and then back down around. They did come back down through that area of Severe Lake, etc. They turn around, and when they've done a 1,700-mile loop, so quite a long loop, a really major exploration. We know that they were primarily tasked with finding a route from Santa Fe to Monterey in California. That was what is generally understood to be the main thing that they were to accomplish. One of the lesser known things that they were charged with, however, was trying to find out all they could about this group of potential Europeans, these bearded native people or whatever they were. And that was one of the things that they were actually able to accomplish, to find out some information about that. And we'll get into that in a little more detail. So let's go to the next slide. So even earlier than Domínguez-Escalante, this is Peñalosa. So this is the 1660s. And the area had been given a name, sort of a mythical name. Tehuayo was this area to the northwest, sort of generally the Utah, the Great Salt Lake. It was an area, and for many years, scholars in this community of people who studied this type of exploration thought that this was a myth, and it was never really seriously considered. But actually, it wasn't a myth, and authorities in Mexico City were very interested in trying to find it. And this is a map that actually shows Tehuayo at the top. So you have, through northern New Mexico, and then sort of in this unspecified area to the north is Tehuayo. Okay, so let's, so one of the important figures that was with Domínguez-Escalante was Miera Pacheco, Bernardo Miera Pacheco, sort of the Renaissance man of 18th century New Mexico, a very skilled cartographer. And this is one of several maps that he made of the expedition. And on this map, he combined Utah Lake and Salt Lake into one lake. And this confusion, so he never actually, the expedition never went all the way around the lake, never searched all the tributaries. So he didn't really know that they were two separate bodies of water. And this confusion lasted very, very long time. He also, they had imagined that there was a river that left from the Great Salt Lake and went to the west coast, the San Buenaventura River. So all these things were things that they thought that they had discovered. John Kessel, sort of eminent Southwestern historian, has a book out, been out for a number of years, called Whither the Waters. And it's the story, as much as anything else, of how Miera y Pacheco's mistake goes down through the years of both the combination of the lakes being incorrect and also the existence of this river that drained the Salt Lake to the coast, which never existed. So that was something that's been around for a long time. Let's go to the next slide. So on one of the several maps that Miera made, he includes, this is another map of the expedition, and you can see he includes the bearded Utes on it. And the way they're attired is exactly what's described in the journal of the expedition. They're wearing sort of a long top that has almost a skirt type thing. And then, of course, they're heavily bearded. And then the women, they're fishing. So these were things that he observed and included in the map. He always included some little something. And you can see that he has on here some of the names that have sort of come down to us as band names for Utes, Tabawatch. So some of these are all on the on his map, labeled on his map, and he's very different, various different Ute groups, and also Comanches. So these were things that, so they were great observers, sort of early ethno-historians, anthropologists, the kind of things they were observing and writing down. And again, this was one of the things that they were really supposed to do. Let's go to the next one. This is just a closer, a close-up of that drawing, and you can see there's really no mistaking the fact that these people have full beards. They were rabbit hunting and fishing and that sort of thing. Now let's go to the next. Now, these are observations from the journal. I'm just going to read them because you probably can't see them. And so these are just quotes. When they encountered these people, they possess good features and most of them are fully bearded. And then another, he had a beard so full and long that he looked like one of the ancient hermits of Europe. And then this longer one. Now, these ones, more fully bearded than the Lagunas, have their nostril cartilage pierced, and in the whole, by way of adornment, they wear a tiny polished bone. In their features, they more resemble the Spaniards than they do all of the other Indians known in America up to now, from whom they differ in what has been said to exist on the other side of the Rio del Tinson, which can be the Colorado River or the Gunnarson, in this case, the Colorado River. They employ the same language, Ute, as the Timpapangotsis. It's a Numic language from the river inside of Santa Isabel onward, and that's the present day Sevier rivers. Begin these full-blooded Indians who perhaps give rise to the report about the Spaniards who were said to exist on the other side of the Rio del Tinson. So this was something they were assigned to do. They're making obviously very careful, detailed observations about what the people look like. And then at a later, as they're moving west, and they move west of the Sevier River, 5 of them who came first with their chief were so fully bearded that they looked like Capuchin Padres or Bethlehemites. So let's look at the next slide. So this is what the Bethlehemites, this is what they're talking about, really full, long beards. Okay. So let's go to the next one. Now, this is a photograph from a much later period, and you can see that even still, these particular individuals have fairly full beards. Okay, so let's go to we're going to leave Domínguez-Escalante, and we're going to move to Juan Rivera. Now, I mentioned Stephen Baker. So Stephen Baker worked with the name Donald Cutter will be familiar to historians of the Southwest. Donald Cutter had a team of researchers working in a military archive in Spain, and they uncovered Juan Rivera's journal. And so Steve Baker and Donald Cutter worked on it. Sometimes they worked together, sometimes they worked sort of against each other. The historiography, to the extent that it was presented originally from Cutter's work was that Juan Rivera had traveled to Utah, etc. And this really was adopted by people in Utah as, the earlier trip. As it turns out, he never went to Utah. He never left Colorado. But the important thing in terms of his expedition in the discovery or the search for the Utes is that the governor of New Mexico at that time, Tomas Velez had instructed Rivera to find these bearded Utes. He wanted to, who are these bearded people? And so that really was as far as the historiography of Spanish expeditions to Tehuayo to encounter these people. This was the first knowledge of it. So, but Domínguez-Escalante really became known in this country only in 1950. Herbert Eugene Bolton published his last work, Pageant in the Wilderness, which was about this expedition, about the previous expedition that we were talking about. And he was completely unaware of this one. I got involved in this project because Steve Baker needed somebody to translate the journal. And so I translated the journal for this particular project. Rivera never met up with the Utes when he was there. But let's go to the next slide. So this was the charge that Velez got him. When they get to the Rio del Tinson, again, that can be the Colorado or it can be the Gunderson. In the case of Rivera, it was the Gunderson, which is a tributary of the Colorado. They, meaning Rivera and his men, shall examine in very great detail which nations inhabit both sides of the river and whether the nations, I mean the Utes, give us the information they give us is true that there are large pueblos on the other side of the river and some type of white people with beards dressed like Europeans. They shall inform themselves well and examine these circumstances. So very serious attempt to determine who these people were. Rivera tried to carry that out. He was supposed to do two things: find out who the Europeans were and find out the source of silver, which is another interesting thing because we know that the Spaniards did not develop the mines in silver, but in Abiquiu, which is where these expeditions left from, they had what are called silver nails, native silver that had been found on the surface. And it had come to Abiquiu from Ute individuals. So, and one of the people who went on Rivera's expedition, Andres Muñiz, also accompanied the Velez-Escalante. And we know that Velez-Escalante had Rivera's journal with them because they refer to it. So it's very cryptic. It doesn't provide an awful lot of detail. It's very hard to discover the route that they took. In order to translate the journal, Steve Baker took me on the route all over the canyon country of southwestern Colorado, because you couldn't really make any sense if you hadn't been over the ground. So that was that. So let's go to the next one. This is probably too small for you to see, but this is a route map of his attempt to make it to Tehuayo. And he never actually made it across the Colorado, what would be the Colorado-Utah line. So it was mostly in southwestern Colorado in that really amazing canyon country. If you're familiar with that country, that's really rough. rough country to be in. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so the next one that I want to talk about is the Baron Lahontan. And this is where actually the earliest information about the bearded Utes comes from. This is a project that a number of people worked on. Steve Baker, Raymond Wood, George Gill, and Claude Fouillade. Only Professor Wood is still among the living. Everybody else that worked on this project passed away before the project was completed. The book was not finished when Baker died. And so I finished the book for them. I had to finish it. And so I sort of tried to edit the text and complete the parts that Baker was not able to finish. And this book is going to be published by Sunstone Press at some point. Let's look at the next one. So the Baron Lahontan was a young French nobleman. He came to Canada as a cadet and served for many years there. And much like Father Domínguez-Escalante, he was a very keen observer of the native peoples. He learned to speak Algonquin, or at least a dialect of Algonquin, while he was living there. He was stationed for most of the time at what is now Fort Michilimackinac, so he was way up there in the North Country. And he was there at the time when Marquette and Joliet and LaSalle and all of these people were actively exploring the rivers. There was a comment I didn't quite catch, but it was some. So one thing that I would say is that Lahontan is in his account of this trip that he supposedly made in 1688 and 89. He's considered one of the great travel liars of all time. There has been considerable doubt that he made the expedition at all, and pretty much roundly criticized. So what this group of scholars was doing was really trying to show that that based on their knowledge of what was in his journals, that he did in fact make it. Whether he did all the things that he talked about in the journal is really not of interest to what I wanted to talk about today. It's really the observations that were made. And again, whether he made them personally or whether someone provided them information, but the early description of the bearded Utes that he supposedly encountered on his trip. So let's look at the next one. So his idea, or the way he tells the story, is that he leaves and he's traveling down the Mississippi, and he eventually goes up the Missouri River, and what he's looking for is a route to the Pacific. So this is sort of that sort of Northwest Passage type thing that so many people have always been looked for. the Flints is, the Shirley and Richard Flint, they've done a tremendous amount of work on the Coronado expedition. And after many, many years, they sort of came down and when they were sort of tying up all their research, Coronado was really looking for a route to the Pacific, that was really the main thing that was driving what he was doing. And so this was certainly something the French crown was very interested in, trying to find a route to the Pacific. And so this whole trip, the reason that it had been so severely discredited, at least in the opinion of these authors, is that the Baron intentionally misled people in where he had been, the direction he had traveled, because he hoped to be given the opportunity to make a larger expedition subsequently. And so he wanted to disguise where he had been. And so that's sort of the whole idea, is that he said he went in one direction in his journal, but when you examine the peoples that he encountered, et cetera, he had to have been in a different place. And so that's sort of that. But again, that's kind of a different thing than what I really wanted to talk about. So let's look at the next slide. So one of the things that, again, that these this particular group of scholars has determined is that he was out on the Platte River. And when he was out on the Platte River, he didn't get any farther to the west than his trip out on the Platte, but that's where he encountered 4 slaves who were the slaves of an Apache group. And they were these 4 heavily bearded native people. And where he found them was a group of Apaches that are called Naxitares, which unfortunately the names that are applied to these don't coordinate very much with, particularly with modern groups. But at any rate, he encountered these 4 people that were held as slaves by this Apache group. Let's go to the next one. So this shows where he went. So from the way up at the top there of Lake Michigan at Michilimackinac, down the river, down the Mississippi, and then out onto the plains, out onto the Platte River. And in the 19th century, when people like Chapman, the early really big figures of American history and Canadian history in the 19th century, when they read the Baron's journal, they just said, this is just all hogwash. This doesn't match anything. None of the native groups that he's talking about are in the areas where he said they were, all of this sort of stuff. And at that time, the sort of the ethno-history and the anthropology was not nearly at the level that it has been, that they've moved on to. And so these particular individuals who were doing this work were experts in this area. And they said that, it's pretty clear that what he's describing was this trip out onto the Platte. So let's look at one more slide. So in the area of sort of this middle southern part of Nebraska on the Platte is where he said that he encountered these people. Now let's look at the next one. So this is from his journal. The journal was published based on what were supposedly a series of long letters, and the journal is sort of a shortened version of the letters that he was writing back to France. And so he says this in the journal: "Poor Mesmelech," that was the name that one of the groups, Mesmelech savages, whom I took for Spaniards. And he was thinking they were people from New Mexico. My mistake was occasioned by the great difference between these two American nations. So he's with Pawnees and Apaches. For the Mesmelech savages were clothed. They had a thick, bushy beard, and their hair hung down under their ears. Their complexion was swarthy. Their address was civil and submissive. Their mien grave. Their carriage engaging. Upon these considerations, I could not imagine that they were savages, though after all I found myself mistaken." Again, this is his observation of these people. So this was the journal that he kept in of the journey that was in 1688, and he encountered these people in 1689. In January of 1689, he encountered these people. He got back to Europe and he published his book in 1705. And the book was a runaway bestseller in Europe. So the information about the existence of these European people living in the Pehuayo, in this area to the northwest of New Mexico, was available to authorities in Spain soon after, so the early 18th century. And so we know that this idea that a European had encountered these people in the Southwest could have made it, and surely did make it, to Mexico City. And that's why the subsequent 18th century people, the expeditions moving into that area, were given the task of trying to figure out who these were. Spain, so New Mexico, when New Mexico was resettled after the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, so 1692 and onwards, when it was resettled as part of a Spanish plan to establish a buffer. And the primary concern was French in Canada and in the plains, encroaching on Spanish territory. And so that was the primary motivation for reestablishing New Mexico. And again, they were very concerned about this idea that there could be Europeans living in that area. So for who are these people, right? That they were encountering. Surely now we've had separated in time, and whether or not Lahontan himself ever made that journey, someone provided that information to him, whether he made it himself, right? So I really don't necessarily have an opinion about whether he made it or not. I mean, if you find this interesting, you can read the book. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in there, and they're advancing their argument for why they think he actually met these people on the Platte. But the question has remained, who were they? They're in the historical record now multiple times. Nobody ever suggested that Domínguez and Escalante never encountered them, right? I mean, they were never subjected to the sort of criticism that the Baron was. And of course, part of that was because the great 19th century historians didn't know anything about Domínguez and Escalante, right? That didn't come about until the 1950s and really big in the 1970s. If you look now, there are multiple translations, interpretations of Domínguez-Escalante that really date from that period. So it's still, relatively speaking, it's sort of recent, and it is certainly worth reconsidering this earlier information. Well, in 1996 in Oregon, two young men encountered a fully intact skull. And so these were just people that were out looking and they discovered this fully intact skull. And then subsequently, when the experts got involved, they found the rest of the fully intact skeleton. This is 1996. This is what came to be called Kennewick Man, or the ancient one, okay? Because it had, according to all the expert analysis, the features were of more Caucasoid, some maybe European person that was there. And so for 30 years, basically archaeologists and I guess anthropologists fought to maintain the access to the skeletal remains, and the native communities wanted them repatriated because they said that was an ancestor of their people, and it should be properly reburied. Okay, so this raged on for 30 years, and in 2017, they worked with 5 tribal groups to obtain DNA samples so that they could sample the Kennewick Man, ancient man DNA, and sample that and test it against the native groups that were willing to share the DNA. And what they determined was, and I believe it was actually the U.S. Army that was doing the research. There were some other labs involved, some people in Denmark, various different things. But the determination was that this person with what looked like the skull of a European person was actually more closely related to Native Americans than it was to any other type of DNA. And they could not determine that it matched any one of the 5 particular tribal groups, but that it definitely was a native. There were native remains. And so they were turned over to the 5 tribal communities, and the remains were subsequently reburied. So this is an artist's conception. So the skull that's in this is the skull that was what was drawn from the Kennewick Man, and then the artist added the hair. because there's really still no definitive explanation for where the heavily bearded people, where they fit in. And I want to close with that because that's sort of the resolution to the story that began with the Baron and his observation